Imagine waking up one morning 11,600 years ago to discover the world is ending. Not in some distant future, not as a slow decline. Right now, today, the ocean is rising faster than you can run. Water is pouring across the land like nothing you've ever seen. Everything your ancestors built, every sacred place, every hunting ground, every shelter, gone, swallowed by waves that seem to have no end. This actually happened. And here's the thing that'll keep you up at night, or maybe help you fall asleep. That's literally why I make these. So, subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check comments and it's amazing. Tokyo at dawn, Texas at midnight, London during lunch. All of you right now learning about the same ancient disaster that nearly erased us. You know that feeling when you hear a story so many times it stops seeming real? Like it's just a fairy tale your grandmother told you? That's what happened to the flood story. Every culture on Earth has one. The Bible's Noah and his ark. The Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Mesopotamia. Hindu texts describing Manu surviving a great flood. Chinese legends of Gun taming the floods. Greek myths of Deucalion. Native American stories of world-drowning waters. Aztec, Mayan, Aboriginal Australian, Polynesian. Hundreds of cultures separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles. All telling basically the same story. A great flood. Nearly everyone dies. A few survivors. The world has to start over. For centuries, scholars assumed these were just myths. Humans love dramatic stories. We exaggerate. We embellish. Of course, ancient people would invent tales about catastrophic floods. They saw rivers overflow, right? They experienced tsunamis and storm surges. Their imaginations did the rest. Except what if they didn't imagine it? What if they remembered it? What if buried in all those ancient stories, distorted by thousands of years of retelling, is the memory of something that actually happened? Something so catastrophic, so world-altering that it became burned into the collective memory of our species. Here's where it gets interesting. Around 11,600 years ago, something did happen. Something that geological evidence, archaeological discoveries, and climate science all point to. The last ice age didn't just end. It ended catastrophically. Ice sheets covering huge portions of North America and Europe, some of them 2 miles thick, melted. Not over thousands of years, over decades, maybe even faster. Where does all that water go? Into the ocean. Sea levels rose by 400 feet. 400 feet. Picture a 40-story building. Now, picture that much water covering land that used to be home to millions of people. But it wasn't just a slow, steady rise. There's evidence, and we'll get into this, that it happened in pulses. Massive ice dams would hold back enormous glacial lakes, sometimes containing more water than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. Then the dam would fail catastrophically. Billions of gallons of meltwater would burst forth in a matter of days or weeks, flooding into the ocean, raising sea levels by feet almost overnight. Now, imagine you're a human living 11,600 years ago. You don't know what an ice age is. You don't understand climate or geology. You just know that your people have lived on this coastline for generations. There are fishing grounds here that your great-great-grandparents used. There are settlements, sacred sites, hunting territories. Then the water starts rising. Not like a tide that comes and goes, like a tide that never stops coming. Day after day, the ocean creeps higher. What used to be a day's walk inland becomes waterfront, then becomes underwater. You move to higher ground. The water follows. Everything you knew about the world, the shape of the coastline, the location of rivers, the distance between lands, all of it is changing faster than you can adapt. This isn't ancient history to these people. This is the apocalypse. And here's what makes this so haunting. We're only now, in the last few decades, starting to understand that this actually happened. Marine archaeologists are finding evidence of human settlements underwater on continental shelves around the world. Structures, tools, campfires, all of it now hundreds of feet below the surface. Climate scientists have identified the exact mechanisms that would have caused rapid catastrophic flooding. Geologists have found the scars left by massive meltwater floods in landscapes around the globe. The evidence is everywhere once you know where to look. And it all points to the same conclusion. About 11,600 years ago, the world our ancestors knew was drowned. Not everywhere, not all at once, but dramatically enough, catastrophically enough that it changed the course of human civilization forever. Tonight, we're going to follow the evidence. We'll look at what caused the Ice Age to end so dramatically. We'll explore the geological proof of massive flooding events. We'll dive into those ancient flood myths and see how they might actually be distorted memories of real events. We'll visit underwater archaeological sites where cities from before the flood still rest on the ocean floor. And we'll talk about what it all means, because this isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how quickly our world can change, how civilizations can be wiped away, and how humans somehow always find a way to survive and remember. So get comfortable. Let's go back 11,600 years to the night the world drowned. To understand what happened 11,600 years ago, you need to picture a world that doesn't exist anymore. Not just slightly different, completely transformed. A planet that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone living today. 13,000 years ago, ice ruled the Earth. And I'm not talking about a bad winter. I'm talking about ice sheets so massive, so incomprehensibly huge, that they made Antarctica look modest. The Laurentide ice sheet alone, covering most of Canada and the northern United States, was 2 miles thick in places. 2 miles. Imagine standing at the bottom and looking up. You wouldn't see the top. It would disappear into clouds and mist like some frozen mountain range that stretched from horizon to horizon. Europe wasn't much better. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia, pushing south into what is now Germany and Poland. Britain was completely buried. So was most of Ireland. These weren't just big glaciers. They were continental-scale masses of ice that had been accumulating for over 100,000 years, compressing under their own weight, slowly grinding down mountains and carving out valleys that would become lakes and rivers when they finally melted. But here's what makes this period so fascinating. The ice was dying. Slowly, reluctantly, but dying nonetheless. For the previous 5,000 years, Earth had been warming. Not steadily. Nothing about Ice Age climate is steady. But the overall trend was clear. Summer temperatures were rising. The ice sheets were beginning to retreat, leaving behind landscapes of raw stone and gravel, moraines marking their maximum extent like battle lines showing where the ice had fought its last stand against the returning warmth. Humans were cautiously following the retreating ice north, moving into territories that had been frozen wasteland for millennia. They found a strange, harsh world. Tundra vegetation spreading across bare ground. Herds of megafauna migrating north with the changing seasons. And always dominating the northern horizon, those massive ice cliffs marking the southern edge of the sheets. Some of these ice cliffs were hundreds of feet high, carving icebergs into meltwater lakes that would have made the Great Lakes look like ponds. The melting was creating entirely new landscapes. Glacial lakes were forming along the ice margins, held in place by natural dams of ice and rock. Some of these lakes were enormous. Lake Agassiz in North America, formed by meltwater from the retreating Laurentide ice sheet, was larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. It stretched from what is now Minnesota to Saskatchewan, a vast inland sea of frigid meltwater, waiting for something to release it. But then, around 12,900 years ago, something happened that shouldn't have been possible. The warming stopped. Not gradually, suddenly. Within a matter of decades, possibly even faster, Earth plunged back into Ice Age conditions. This period is called the Younger Dryas, named after a hardy Arctic flower that suddenly appeared in European sediments where temperate plants had been growing just years before. The Younger Dryas wasn't supposed to happen. Climate doesn't work like that. You don't get 5,000 years of warming, ice sheets in full retreat, human populations expanding into new territories, and then boom, back to Ice Age cold in a single human lifetime. But that's exactly what the evidence shows. Temperature proxies from ice cores, sediment cores, tree rings all tell the same story. Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped catastrophically. In Greenland, average temperatures fell by 27 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. For the humans living through it, it must have seemed like the world was ending. Summers that had been getting progressively warmer suddenly turned cold again. Growing seasons shortened. Game animals moved south following the vegetation zones that were rapidly contracting. The great megafauna herds that had survived the warming began to feel the pressure. And the ice, which had been retreating for millennia, stabilized, even advanced in some regions. But here's the really weird part. The Younger Dryas wasn't global. It hit the northern hemisphere hard, particularly regions around the North Atlantic, but the southern hemisphere barely noticed. Some regions there actually got warmer during this period. Whatever caused the Younger Dryas, it disrupted northern hemisphere climate specifically, not the entire planet. This tells us something important. The trigger wasn't something simple like volcanic eruptions or changes in Earth's orbit. It was something that could affect regional climate systems catastrophically while leaving others relatively untouched. For 1,300 years, the Younger Dryas persisted. More than 50 human generations born into a world that seemed locked in permanent cold. The archaeological record from this period shows human populations under stress. Settlement sites abandoned. Evidence of increased violence between groups competing for shrinking resources. The easy expansion that had characterized the previous millennia ground to a halt. The megafauna were suffering too. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears. All the magnificent Ice Age mammals that had dominated the landscape for hundreds of thousands of years. They had survived the warming. They had adapted to changing vegetation zones and shifting prey populations. But the Younger Dryas added new pressures. Colder temperatures meant less vegetation. Less vegetation meant harder competition for food. And increasingly they were competing not just with each other but with humans who were becoming more sophisticated hunters every generation. Now let's talk about what the world actually looked like during this period because the geography was radically different from today. All that water locked up in ice sheets had to come from somewhere. And that somewhere was the oceans. Sea levels during the Ice Age maximum had been about 400 feet lower than today. By 13,000 years ago, they had risen somewhat as the ice began melting, but they were still roughly 200 to 250 feet lower than modern levels. This meant coastlines were completely different. What is now the seafloor was dry land. The North Sea between Britain and continental Europe, that was a vast plain called Doggerland, rich in resources, probably heavily populated. The Persian Gulf was mostly dry land. The islands of Southeast Asia were connected to the mainland. Australia and New Guinea were a single landmass. Florida extended much farther into what is now the Gulf of Mexico. And here's what's crucial. These exposed coastal plains weren't marginal territories. They were prime real estate, flat, often fertile, with access to both marine and terrestrial resources. River systems that now end underwater used to extend for miles farther, creating estuaries and deltas in areas that are now deep ocean. These would have been incredibly attractive to human settlement. We have good reason to think that most major human populations during this period lived in coastal zones. It makes perfect sense. Coastal areas offered diverse food sources. Shellfish, fish, marine mammals, waterfowl, plus game and plants from inland areas. The archaeological evidence supports this. The few coastal sites from this period that haven't been drowned show intensive human occupation. But here's the problem. Most of those coastal sites are now underwater. They've been underwater for 11,000 years. Any evidence of human habitation, any artifacts, any indication of what early civilizations might have existed, it's all buried under hundreds of feet of ocean. We're essentially blind to where most humans were actually living during this period. The archaeological record we have comes from inland sites, secondary territories, backup camps. The main settlements, the places where the most people lived, are gone. Think about what that means. Every now and then, marine archaeologists find something unexpected. A worked stone tool in deep water. A submerged cave with human remains. Evidence of ancient settlements far from any modern coastline. Each discovery suggests we're missing huge pieces of the human story. Pieces that were erased when sea levels rose. But let's get back to the Ice Age world itself. Despite the return to cold during the Younger Dryas, life continued in the regions around the ice sheets. Massive herds of megafauna still roamed. Mammoths in North America and Siberia, moving in herds that could number in the thousands. These weren't the tiny Asian elephants you see in zoos. Imperial mammoths stood 14 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed up to 10 tons. They were giants, living embodiment of the Ice Age world. Alongside them, mastodons browsed in the forests. Giant ground sloths, some as large as modern elephants, fed on tree leaves they could reach with their enormous claws. Saber-toothed cats, multiple species of them, hunted the herbivores. Short-faced bears, the largest land predators of the era, competed with human hunters for the same prey. Giant beavers the size of black bears built dams in northern rivers. Glyptodons, armored mammals that looked like Volkswagen Beetles with tails, lumbered across the landscape. This wasn't just a different climate. It was a different planet, one where megafauna still ruled, where ecosystems functioned on a scale we can barely imagine today. The herds of bison that would later dominate the American Great Plains were there too, but sharing the landscape with creatures that seem almost mythological now. Europe had its own megafauna assemblage. Cave lions larger than any modern lion. Woolly rhinoceros adapted to cold climates. Irish elk with antlers spanning 12 feet. Giant hyenas, all living alongside human populations that were becoming increasingly sophisticated. And humans were innovating. The Younger Dryas, as harsh as it was, forced rapid cultural evolution. People who had relied on abundant resources during the warming had to adapt to scarcity again. They developed better hunting tools. Atlatls, spear throwers that could launch projectiles with deadly force. Increasingly sophisticated traps and snares. Better techniques for preserving food through cold periods. More importantly, they were developing social technologies. Trade networks expanded, allowing groups to share resources and information across vast distances. There's evidence of raw materials moving hundreds of miles from their sources. Obsidian from volcanic regions. High-quality flint from specific quarries. Shells from coastal areas showing up far inland. This wasn't random movement. This was systematic exchange, suggesting stable relationships between distant communities. Some researchers think we might be seeing the very earliest signs of what would become agriculture. In the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coast, there's evidence of people intensively harvesting wild grains around 13,000 years ago. They were building permanent settlements, unusual for hunter-gatherers. They were creating storage facilities for grain. They might have been taking the first tentative steps toward domesticating plants and animals. But all of this, the megafauna, the expanding human populations, the emerging trade networks, the possible early agriculture, all of it existed in a state of delicate balance. The Younger Dryas had created a climate that was harsh but stable. Humans and animals had adapted to it over 1,300 years. Ecosystems had reached a kind of equilibrium, with each species occupying its ecological niche. Then, around 11,600 years ago, that balance shattered. The Younger Dryas ended. But it didn't end gradually. It ended catastrophically. Temperature proxies show warming happening faster than climate scientists thought possible until they saw the evidence. In Greenland, temperatures rose by 18 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. Some estimates suggest the change might have happened even faster, possibly within a single year. The ice sheets, which had been stable for over a millennium, suddenly began collapsing. And when ice sheets collapse, when trillions of tons of frozen water suddenly become liquid and mobile, the results are apocalyptic. Those massive glacial lakes like Lake Agassiz, held in place by ice dams for thousands of years, the dams failed. The water had to go somewhere, and the only place it could go was into the oceans, raising sea levels in a geological instant, drowning coastlines where humans had lived for millennia. But it wasn't just gradual sea level rise. The evidence suggests something more immediate, more violent. Something that would explain why every culture in the world has flood myths. Something that would justify the terror in those ancient stories. Because what was coming wasn't just water. It was the end of the world as those humans knew it. The greatest natural disaster in human history. The deluge that would change everything. And it all started with ice. Ice that had ruled the earth for over 100,000 years. Ice that was finally, catastrophically, melting all at once. So we've set the stage. The Ice Age is ending. Glaciers that have covered half the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years are finally retreating. Sea levels are rising gradually as all that frozen water melts back into the oceans. Humanity is cautiously expanding into newly habitable territories, building settlements along coastlines and river valleys that have been locked under ice for millennia. Everything seems to be going well. The world is warming. Resources are becoming more abundant. Human populations are growing. And then something catastrophic happened. To understand what triggered the Great Flood, we need to talk about the Laurentide ice sheet. This wasn't just any glacier. This was a continent-sized mass of ice that covered essentially all of Canada and extended down into what's now the northern United States. At its maximum extent, it was over 2 miles thick in places. 2 miles of solid ice pressing down on the Earth's crust with unimaginable weight. When this thing started melting around 15,000 years ago, it didn't just disappear overnight. It retreated in stages, leaving behind a landscape that had been completely reshaped by its weight. The Earth's crust, compressed under billions of tons of ice for millennia, began slowly rebounding upward. Valleys that had been carved out by glacial movement became basins. Natural ice dams held back massive quantities of meltwater. And that's where Lake Agassiz comes in. Picture the largest lake you've ever seen. Now multiply it by about 100. Lake Agassiz at its maximum extent was bigger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. Significantly bigger. We're talking about a body of water that covered parts of what's now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Minnesota, and North Dakota. A freshwater sea sitting right in the middle of North America. But here's the terrifying part. It was held back by nothing more than ice dams and moraines, ridges of debris left behind by retreating glaciers. Natural barriers that seemed solid enough until they weren't. Around 11,600 years ago, something went catastrophically wrong. The exact trigger is still debated by scientists, but the evidence points to one of two scenarios. Maybe both happened simultaneously, making everything worse. The first and most widely accepted theory is straightforward but horrifying. The ice dam failed. After thousands of years of holding back trillions of gallons of meltwater, the barriers created by glacial ice finally gave way. Maybe it was gradual erosion. Maybe a particularly warm summer caused accelerated melting. Maybe an earthquake destabilized the ice. We'll probably never know the exact moment or mechanism, but we know what happened next because the geological evidence is overwhelming. The entire contents of Lake Agassiz, an amount of water that defies comprehension, began pouring toward the ocean. Not gradually over centuries, not slowly over generations, but explosively, catastrophically, in a matter of years, possibly even months. Think about that for a second. Imagine a body of water larger than all the Great Lakes suddenly deciding to empty itself into the Atlantic Ocean all at once. The flow rates would have been absolutely biblical. Some estimates suggest that at peak discharge, more water was flowing out of Lake Agassiz than currently flows through all the world's rivers combined. This wasn't a flood. This was a planetary-scale catastrophe. But some scientists think it was even worse than that. The second theory, more controversial but increasingly supported by evidence, involves something from space. Around the same time as the Lake Agassiz drainage event, right at the boundary between the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs, there's a thin layer in the geological record that doesn't make sense. Contains materials that shouldn't be there. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that form under extreme pressure and temperature. Magnetic spherules, tiny balls of iron that show signs of being heated to incredible temperatures. A layer of carbon deposits suggesting massive widespread fires. Most tellingly, elevated levels of platinum group elements that are extremely rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 12,800 years ago, Earth was hit by fragments of a disintegrating comet. Not one massive impact like the one that killed the dinosaurs, but multiple air bursts and impacts scattered across the northern hemisphere. The kind of cosmic bombardment that would have instantly vaporized any ice it struck. Imagine a comet fragment maybe half a mile across slamming into the Laurentide ice sheet at tens of thousands of miles per hour. The energy released would have been equivalent to hundreds of nuclear bombs. Ice that had been solid for millennia would have instantly become superheated steam. The shock wave would have fractured ice dams across thousands of square miles. And if multiple fragments hit different parts of the ice sheet, which the evidence suggests they did, you'd have simultaneous catastrophic failures across the entire glacial system. Lake Agassiz wouldn't just breach, it would explode outward in multiple directions at once. This would explain something that has always puzzled scientists about the flood evidence. The water didn't just flow toward the Atlantic. Geological markers show massive flooding events happening almost simultaneously toward Hudson Bay, toward the Gulf of Mexico, through the Mississippi River system, and possibly even through the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's like someone had dropped multiple bombs on a dam, blowing it apart in all directions at once. The geological evidence for what happened next is preserved in something called Meltwater Pulse 1b. Geologists studying ancient coral reefs, ice cores, and sediment layers have identified a period around 11,600 years ago when global sea levels rose catastrophically fast. We're not talking about the gradual rise that had been happening as the Ice Age ended. This was different. Sea levels jumped upward by anywhere from 15 to 45 feet in less than 50 years. Some estimates suggest it might have happened even faster, possibly in just a few decades. To put that in perspective, modern sea level rise that scientists worry about amounts to about 3 millimeters per year. That's concerning enough, threatening coastal cities over the next century. But Meltwater Pulse 1b represents sea level rise of potentially 300 millimeters per year, 100 times faster than what we're experiencing today. This wasn't water gradually creeping up beaches. This was coastlines being redrawn in real time. This was entire landscapes disappearing beneath the waves within a single human lifetime. The mechanism is straightforward physics, but the scale is almost incomprehensible. When Lake Agassiz drained, millions, possibly billions of cubic kilometers of fresh water suddenly entered the world's oceans. But water doesn't just spread out evenly. It follows currents, fills basins, and displaces existing water in complex patterns. First, the immediate impact zone. The meltwater would have created a massive freshwater layer on top of the denser saltwater ocean. This fresh water would have been frigid, straight from a glacial lake, and it would have spread outward from the release points like a frozen blanket being thrown over the North Atlantic. This created immediate chaos in the ocean circulation systems. The North Atlantic has a critical current system that depends on temperature and salinity differences to function. Warm, salty water flows north from the tropics. When it reaches the Arctic, it cools, becomes denser, and sinks, creating a circulation pattern that helps regulate global climate. Suddenly dump billions of cubic kilometers of fresh water into the system and it shuts down. The dense salty water can't sink through the lighter freshwater layer. The whole circulation pattern stalls. Europe, which depends on warm water flowing north to maintain its moderate climate, suddenly finds itself cut off from its primary heat source. Meanwhile, all that water has to go somewhere. As it spread across the ocean's surface, it raised sea levels globally, but not evenly. The Earth's rotation, the shape of ocean basins, and the distribution of continents meant some areas experienced far more dramatic flooding than others. Coastal regions around the North Atlantic were hit first and hardest. The British Isles, which at the time were still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge called Doggerland, found themselves becoming islands as water poured through the English Channel. Communities that had existed for thousands of years on what's now the North Sea floor were inundated in a matter of years. The Mediterranean, connected to the Atlantic by the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, became a funnel concentrating the flood. Sea levels in the Mediterranean rose even faster than in the open ocean. Coastal settlements around the entire Mediterranean basin, from Spain to Turkey, from North Africa to Greece, were swallowed by rapidly advancing waters. But the chaos wasn't limited to rising sea levels. The sudden influx of fresh water triggered a cascade of climate disruptions that affected the entire planet. Ice core evidence from Greenland shows dramatic temperature swings happening over periods of just a few years. Not gradual warming or cooling, but wild oscillations as climate systems tried to find a new equilibrium. The shutdown of North Atlantic circulation meant heat that normally traveled north stayed in the tropics. This intensified monsoon systems in Africa and Asia, causing catastrophic rainfall in some regions, while others experienced sudden droughts. The feedback loops were incredibly complex. Changed rainfall patterns affected vegetation, which affected albedo, how much sunlight the Earth reflects back to space, which affected temperature, which affected ice melt rates, which released more water, which disrupted currents further. It was a planetary climate system being thrown into absolute chaos by the injection of more fresh water than it could handle. And it all happened in the span of decades, maybe even faster. Sediment layers from this period tell a story of catastrophe. In lake beds and ocean floors around the world, there's a distinct boundary layer from around 11,600 years ago. Below it, you find sediments that show gradual, predictable climate change. Above it, chaos. Mixed sediments showing multiple flooding events. Deposits of materials that originated hundreds of miles away, carried by unprecedented flood currents. Layers of clay and silt that could only have been deposited by massive, fast-moving water. Most tellingly, there are what geologists call turbidites, sediment layers created by underwater landslides. When sea levels rise rapidly, coastal slopes become unstable. Entire sections of continental shelf can suddenly slide into deeper water, creating underwater avalanches that deposit distinctive sediment patterns. The period around 11,600 years ago shows more turbidite layers than any comparable period in the previous 100,000 years. The coastlines weren't just flooding, they were collapsing. Some scientists have tried to calculate just how much water we're talking about. The estimates are staggering. At minimum, you're looking at enough water to raise global sea levels by 15 feet. That represents roughly 5 million cubic kilometers of water. To put that in perspective, all the water in all the rivers on Earth right now amounts to about 2,000 cubic kilometers. We're talking about releasing 2,500 times more water than exists in every river on the planet, and doing it in a span of decades. The upper estimates are even more terrifying. If sea levels rose by 45 feet, which some evidence suggests, you're looking at 15 million cubic kilometers of water. That's not just Lake Agassiz. That's Lake Agassiz plus the simultaneous failure of other glacial lakes across the northern hemisphere. That's multiple ice dams failing simultaneously, possibly triggered by those comet impacts. That's the end of the Ice Age happening not over thousands of years, but in a single catastrophic event. The chain reaction that followed reshaped the planet. Ocean currents that had been stable for thousands of years were disrupted for centuries. Climate patterns that humanity had learned to predict became chaotic and unpredictable. Coastlines where civilizations had been building for generations simply disappeared beneath the waves. This wasn't just a flood. This was the moment when the world as humanity knew it ended. When the comfortable, predictable patterns that had allowed population growth and settlement suddenly shattered. When the rising waters didn't stop at the high tide line but kept coming, day after day, year after year, swallowing everything humanity had built in the coastal zones where most people lived. And the terrifying thing, the people experiencing it would have had no idea what was happening or why. They just knew the water was rising. The storms were getting worse. The climate was going insane. And nothing they did could stop it. The trigger had been pulled. The flood was coming. And humanity was about to face its greatest test. Picture this. You're living 11,600 years ago in a thriving coastal settlement. Your people have been here for generations. You know every fishing spot, every freshwater spring, every stand of trees that provides the best wood for your boats. The ocean is your highway, your pantry, your livelihood. Then one day you notice the tide doesn't go out as far as it used to. At first, it's subtle, a few feet here and there. Your fishing spots are a little deeper than they were last year. The beach where your children play is narrower. You mention it to your elders and they nod slowly. They've noticed too. But nobody's worried yet. The sea has always had its moods, its cycles. This will pass. Except it doesn't pass. Year after year, the water keeps rising. That beach where your children played, it's gone now, swallowed entirely. The freshwater springs your people have used for generations, contaminated by seawater. The fishing grounds that were waist deep, now you can't even see the bottom. And then comes the surge. Because here's the thing about those 400 feet of sea level rise over several centuries. It didn't happen smoothly. It didn't rise like water slowly filling a bathtub. The climate system doesn't work that way. It's full of feedback loops, tipping points, catastrophic releases that happen all at once. The overall rise was gradual, a few inches per decade on average. But within that gradual trend were periods of terrifying acceleration. Times when massive ice sheets, destabilized by centuries of warming, would suddenly collapse. Billions of tons of ice sliding into the ocean in a matter of years or even months. When that happened, sea levels didn't creep upward. They surged 10 feet, 20 feet, 50 feet in a single generation. Imagine trying to adapt to that. Your entire village has to move inland. You find a new site, build new homes, establish new fishing grounds. Then 30 years later, you have to move again, and again, and again. Some communities managed these migrations successfully. They were nomadic enough, resilient enough to pack up and relocate when the waters demanded it. They survived by becoming permanent refugees, always moving ahead of the rising tide. But others weren't so lucky. The archaeological record from this period shows something heartbreaking. Settlements that were occupied for centuries, showing steady cultural development, sophisticated tool industries, elaborate burial practices, suddenly abandoned. Not destroyed by war or fire or disease, just left behind as the waters rose. People grabbed what they could carry and fled inland, leaving behind everything else. Their homes, their workshops, their ceremonial sites, their entire way of life, drowned beneath waves that would never recede. And we're not talking about a few isolated villages. We're talking about entire civilizations, coastal societies that might have been the most advanced human cultures of their time. Because here's what most people don't realize. The best real estate 12,000 years ago wasn't in the mountains or the interior plains. It was on the coast. Coastal regions offered incredible resource abundance. Marine foods, shellfish, fish, sea mammals. Estuaries where rivers met the sea, creating incredibly productive ecosystems. Easy transportation via boats. Mild climates moderated by ocean proximity. If you wanted to support a large sedentary population, if you wanted to develop specialized crafts and complex social hierarchies, the coast was where you built your civilization. Which means when the waters rose, they consumed humanity's most developed societies. The flooding of the Black Sea is perhaps the most dramatic example we can point to with certainty. Around 7,600 years ago, long after the main pulse of post-glacial sea level rise had ended, the Black Sea experienced its own catastrophic flood. For millennia, it had been a freshwater lake fed by rivers but sealed off from the Mediterranean by a natural land dam at what's now the Bosphorus Strait. The lake sat about 500 feet below global sea level. It was surrounded by fertile plains that supported thriving agricultural communities. Then the Mediterranean, swollen by meltwater, finally breached the barrier. What happened next was apocalyptic. Water began pouring through the breach at a rate that staggers the imagination. Geological studies suggest the flow exceeded 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. That's not a flood. That's a waterfall the size of a city, running continuously for years. The roar would have been audible for hundreds of miles. The ground would have shaken with the force of it. The Black Sea began rising at a rate of about 6 inches per day. Think about that. You wake up in the morning and walk down to the lake shore. By sunset, the water is half a foot closer to your village. The next day, another 6 inches. And the next. And the next. Within a year, the shoreline had advanced 200 feet inland. Within 2 years, the lake level had risen over 300 feet, transforming it from a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea. The fertile plains that had surrounded it, possibly home to tens of thousands of people, were gone, drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water. The people living there would have seen it coming. They would have had time to flee, to gather their families and their animals, and move to higher ground. But they couldn't save their homes, their fields, their entire agricultural infrastructure. Everything they had built over generations, swallowed by an inland sea that appeared in what must have seemed like the blink of an eye. Some researchers believe this event, this specific catastrophic flood, is the source of the flood myths found throughout the Middle East and Mediterranean. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah, even Greek flood legends, they all might trace back to collective memories of the Black Sea deluge. Traumatic cultural memories passed down through countless generations, transformed into stories about gods and divine punishment, but retaining the core truth. The world flooded. Our ancestors survived. Everyone else drowned. But the Black Sea was just one event, one particularly dramatic example. Across the world, similar stories were playing out. Different timescales, different mechanisms, but the same basic pattern. Human civilizations consumed by rising waters. Doggerland is the ghost that haunts European archaeology. For millennia, it was the heartland of northwestern Europe, a low-lying plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe, roughly the size of modern England. It wasn't marginal territory. It was prime real estate, crisscrossed by rivers, dotted with lakes, teeming with game. Recent underwater surveys have revealed what looks like a sophisticated landscape. River valleys that show signs of human management. Concentrations of stone tools suggesting permanent settlements. Evidence of complex societies with developed cultures. Then the waters came. Doggerland's doom was gradual at first. As sea levels rose, the southern portions flooded, creating islands and marshlands. The northern hills remained dry and populations retreated there, condensing into smaller territories. But around 8,200 years ago came the final blow. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, generated a tsunami that swept across the North Sea. When it hit the remaining high ground of Doggerland, it would have been devastating. Not tall like modern tsunamis hitting steep coasts, but vast. An enormous surge that simply rolled over the low-lying landscape. Anyone who survived the initial wave would have found their land permanently flooded. Within a few generations, Doggerland was completely submerged, and Britain became an island. We'll never know how many people died, how many communities were obliterated, how much knowledge, culture, and technological innovation was lost. Because it's all down there, buried under hundreds of feet of sediment and North Sea water. An entire civilization erased so completely that we only rediscovered its existence in the 1990s when fishing boats started dredging up stone tools and mammoth bones from the seafloor. Sundaland is even more haunting because of its sheer scale. For most of the last ice age, Southeast Asia looked nothing like it does today. What are now the islands of Indonesia, the Philippines, Borneo, and Java were connected to mainland Asia by a vast subcontinent called Sundaland. It was twice the size of India, a massive extension of Asia, stretching almost to Australia, connected to New Guinea by another land bridge, and it was paradise. Tropical, fertile, blessed with incredible biodiversity and coastal resources on every side. If you wanted to support large populations 15,000 years ago, Sundaland was prime territory. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests it was heavily populated, possibly one of the major centers of human civilization during the Ice Age, with large permanent settlements, sophisticated maritime cultures, and extensive trade networks. Then it drowned. Almost all of it. As sea levels rose those 400 feet, Sundaland fragmented and disappeared. The low-lying interior flooded first, creating vast inland seas that eventually merged with the ocean. Coastal populations fled to higher ground, which became islands, which then shrank as the waters kept rising. By 8,000 years ago, the process was essentially complete. Where there had been a subcontinent, now there were scattered islands separated by deep ocean. If Sundaland had been heavily populated, and all evidence suggests it was, then this represents possibly the greatest disaster in human history. Millions of people displaced, countless settlements destroyed, entire civilizations and their accumulated knowledge wiped out so thoroughly we may never find a trace. Some researchers speculate that Sundaland might have been the source of some of humanity's most important innovations. The evidence for early agriculture, for sophisticated boat building, for complex social organization, all of it appears suddenly in the region surrounding Sundaland right around the time of its final submersion. Coincidence? Or were these technologies developed over millennia in Sundaland, then carried by refugees to the surrounding regions when their homeland drowned? We can't know for certain, but the timing is suggestive. The archaeological record shows a massive pulse of migration radiating out from Southeast Asia right around 8,000 years ago. Austronesian peoples suddenly expanding across the Pacific. Agricultural technologies appearing in southern China. Maritime cultures emerging along the Asian coast. It looks like a diaspora, like millions of people fleeing a homeland that no longer existed. The Persian Gulf tells a similar story on a smaller scale. Today, it's a shallow sea, but during the Ice Age, it was a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which now empty into the Persian Gulf separately, were tributaries of a single massive river that flowed down the center of the exposed Gulf floor and emptied into the Indian Ocean near the Strait of Hormuz. This valley would have been incredibly fertile, well-watered, protected from harsh weather, teeming with resources, exactly the kind of place where early human civilizations would thrive. As sea levels rose, the lower portions of the valley began to flood. The process took thousands of years, but it was relentless. Communities had to continually move upstream, abandoning settlement after settlement to the advancing waters. By about 8,000 years ago, the flooding was complete. The Persian Gulf as we know it today existed, and whatever civilizations had flourished in that river valley were gone. But here's what's tantalizing. The oldest Mesopotamian flood myths don't just describe a flood. They describe a flood that came from the south, from the direction of the sea. They describe cities being submerged, knowledge being lost, survivors fleeing north to the highlands. They describe exactly what would have happened during the flooding of the Persian Gulf Valley. Some researchers believe that Sumerian civilization, which appeared seemingly fully formed around 5,000 years ago with writing, mathematics, astronomy, and sophisticated social organization, might have had deeper roots. That the Sumerians might have been cultural descendants of refugees from the drowned valley. People who carried north the accumulated knowledge of a much older civilization. Impossible to prove, but fascinating to contemplate. The Mediterranean coastlines were radically transformed too, though the process there was somewhat less catastrophic because much of the Mediterranean coast is mountainous. Sea level rise meant beaches and coastal plains flooded, but steep coasts meant people could simply move a few miles inland and remain in similar territory. But even there, the impact was enormous. Everywhere humans had built near the water, and humans always build near water, they had to relocate. The archaeological record shows the same pattern around the entire Mediterranean basin. Coastal sites occupied for millennia, suddenly abandoned around 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. Settlement patterns shifting inland. Coastal caves that had been occupied since the Neanderthals went underwater. Entire landscapes transformed beyond recognition. The human toll of this centuries-long disaster is impossible to calculate precisely, but we can make educated estimates. Conservative archaeological assessments suggest global human population around 12,000 years ago was maybe 5 to 10 million people. A substantial proportion, possibly 30 to 40%, would have lived in coastal regions or major river valleys affected by the flooding. That's 2 to 4 million people displaced. Some migrated successfully. They adapted, found new territories, rebuilt their societies in safer locations. But others wouldn't have been so fortunate. Climate refugees have never been universally welcomed. When hundreds of thousands of people tried to move inland, they encountered other groups already living there. Sometimes they were absorbed. Sometimes they were allowed to settle in marginal territories. Sometimes there was conflict. Skeletal remains from this period show increasing evidence of violence. Massacres, fortified settlements, traumatic injuries consistent with warfare. The flood didn't just displace people. It created competition for the remaining habitable land. It collapsed established social systems and triggered migrations that destabilized communities thousands of miles from the coasts. Early agricultural societies in the Middle East suddenly had to absorb waves of refugees from flooded river valleys. European hunter-gatherers found their territories invaded by displaced populations from Doggerland and the flooded North European plain. Asian communities dealt with millions fleeing from Sundaland. The entire global system of human settlement was thrown into chaos. Old alliances meant nothing. Traditional territories were abandoned. Cultural knowledge was lost as societies fragmented and reformed. This was more than just a flood. This was a complete reorganization of human civilization. Everything that came before, all the social and technological development of the Ice Age, was disrupted so fundamentally that humanity had to essentially start over. The world our ancestors had known for thousands of years was gone, drowned beneath waves that would never recede. And the survivors, traumatized and displaced, had to build something new. Here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating. Because humanity didn't just survive the Great Flood 11,600 years ago. We remembered it. Not in history books, not in archaeological records, but in something far more primal and persistent. Stories. Myths passed down generation after generation, parent to child, elder to youth, for over 11 millennia. And here's the thing that makes this incredible. These stories aren't just similar. They're remarkably, almost impossibly consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other for thousands of years. We're talking about flood narratives from Mesopotamia to the Americas, from India to Australia, from Greece to China, all describing essentially the same catastrophic event. A world-destroying deluge sent by divine forces. A few survivors warned in advance. Humanity saved by the narrowest of margins. And a world fundamentally changed when the waters finally receded. The oldest written version we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE. But the story itself is much older. Scholars believe the flood narrative in Gilgamesh dates back to at least 2800 BCE, maybe earlier, preserved in oral tradition before anyone thought to write it down. In the epic, the hero Gilgamesh seeks immortality and encounters Utnapishtim, the only human ever granted eternal life by the gods. And Utnapishtim tells him why. He describes how the gods decided to destroy humanity with a catastrophic flood. How he was warned by the god Ea to build a massive boat. How he loaded it with his family, craftsmen, and animals of every kind. The description is specific, detailed, almost technical. The boat was to be a perfect cube, 120 cubits on each side, sealed with bitumen inside and out, built with 6 decks and 7 compartments. Then came the flood itself. Utnapishtim described 6 days and 6 nights of storms so violent that even the gods were terrified. Floods so massive that the world was returned to primordial chaos. When it finally ended, his boat had come to rest on a mountain. He sent out birds to test if the waters had receded. First a dove, which returned. Then a swallow, which also returned. Finally a raven, which didn't come back. Proof that dry land had emerged somewhere. Sound familiar? That's because this same story, with remarkably similar details, appears in Genesis as the story of Noah's Ark. Noah, a righteous man in a corrupt world, warned by God of coming destruction, instructed to build an ark to specific dimensions, told to bring his family and pairs of every animal. The flood comes. Waters cover the earth. Everything dies except what's on the ark. The boat comes to rest on a mountain, Mount Ararat. Noah sends out birds to test for dry land. A raven first, then a dove that returns, then another dove that brings back an olive branch. Proof that plants are growing again. The parallels are so exact that scholars have long debated which story came first. But here's what's really interesting. Neither story might be the original. Both might be variations of an even older narrative, a true memory of actual events that had been preserved in oral tradition for thousands of years before anyone in Mesopotamia or ancient Israel thought to write it down. Because the same story shows up in Hindu tradition, and these versions are completely independent of Middle Eastern narratives. In the Satapatha Brahmana, one of the oldest Hindu texts, there's the story of Manu, the first man. One day, while performing ablutions in a river, a tiny fish spoke to Manu and warned him that a great flood was coming that would destroy all life. The fish told Manu to build a boat and prepare to save himself. Manu did as instructed, and the fish, which was actually the god Vishnu in disguise, grew enormous and guided Manu's boat through the devastating floods that consumed the world. When the waters finally receded, Manu found himself alone, the last human alive. From Manu, according to Hindu tradition, all of subsequent humanity descended. It's a different god, a different hero, even a different mechanism, a fish instead of birds, but the core elements are identical. Divine warning, catastrophic flood, one family surviving to repopulate the earth. The Greeks had their version too. In their mythology, Zeus became disgusted with human wickedness and decided to destroy the race of bronze men by flooding the earth. But Prometheus, the titan who had given fire to humanity, warned his son Deucalion of the coming disaster. Deucalion built a chest, basically a boat, and floated in it with his wife Pyrrha for 9 days and 9 nights while the world drowned. When the waters subsided, their chest came to rest on Mount Parnassus. They were told to throw the bones of their mother behind them. They figured out this meant stones, the bones of Mother Earth, and each stone Deucalion threw became a man. Each stone Pyrrha threw became a woman. Humanity was reborn from the survivors and their divine intervention. Different gods, different mountain, different method of repopulation, but the same fundamental story. The world was wicked. The gods sent a flood. 2 people survived on a boat. Humanity got a second chance. Now here's where it gets really wild. These same flood narratives show up in the Americas, among cultures that had zero contact with Europe, Asia, or the Middle East for over 12,000 years. The Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region tell of a great flood sent when humans became arrogant and forgot the teachings of the spirits. Only Nanabozo, a cultural hero, survived by floating on a log with various animals. He sent animals diving to find earth beneath the waters. Several tried and failed, drowning in the attempt. Finally, Muskrat succeeded, bringing up a tiny bit of mud, which Nanabozo used to recreate the world. The Hopi of the American Southwest describe how the Third World was destroyed by flood because people had become corrupt. A few righteous people were saved by climbing inside hollow reeds that floated on the waters. When they emerged, they found themselves in the Fourth World, our current age. The Aztecs believed that the world had been destroyed and recreated multiple times, and one of those destructions was by water. The fourth sun, they called it, an age that ended when the goddess Calcayatlicu cried tears that flooded the earth for 52 years. Some humans survived by transforming into fish, but the world as it had been was completely destroyed. Even tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin have flood stories. The Tlingit of Alaska describe how Raven warned a man to build a raft because a great flood was coming. The Mapuche of Chile tell of a battle between 2 serpent gods that caused the sea to overflow and drown the world. Only a few people survived by climbing to the top of a sacred mountain. The patterns are everywhere you look. Divine warning or divine cause. Catastrophic water. A few survivors, usually on a boat or mountain. A world forever changed. In China, the flood narratives are even more detailed because they became intertwined with actual history. The legend of Gun and Yu describes a great flood that plagued China during the reign of Emperor Yao around 2200 BCE, according to traditional chronologies. The floods were so catastrophic that they threatened to destroy all of Chinese civilization. Gun, a divine being, was tasked with controlling the floods but failed. His son, Yu, succeeded by dredging channels and creating waterways that allowed the floodwaters to drain into the sea. Yu's success in flood control was so important that he became emperor and founded the Xia dynasty, China's first dynasty. Now, Western scholars used to dismiss this as pure mythology, but archaeological work in recent decades has found evidence of massive flooding along the Yellow River around 1900 BCE, caused by a landslide dam that burst catastrophically. This suggests that, like many flood myths, the Chinese legends might preserve actual memories of real disasters. Memories that got magnified and mythologized over time. The Aboriginal Australians, who have maintained continuous cultural traditions for over 50,000 years, have some of the most geographically specific flood narratives in the world. And here's what makes them remarkable. They describe actual places that are now underwater. The Narungga people of South Australia tell of a time when you could walk to Kangaroo Island, which is now separated from the mainland by a strait several miles wide. Their stories describe people trapped on the island when the waters rose, unable to return home. The Yolngu people of Northern Australia describe the flooding of the Gulf of Carpentaria, telling of a time when the Gulf was dry land full of freshwater springs. Their stories name specific places that are now 50 meters underwater. These aren't vague mythological statements. These are precise descriptions of real geography that hasn't been visible for thousands of years. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, Australia's coastline changed dramatically. The land bridge between Australia and New Guinea flooded. Islands became separated from the mainland. Entire territories disappeared beneath the waves, and Aboriginal peoples remembered, passing down stories with such accuracy that modern archaeologists can use them to identify submerged features. But here's the question that should blow your mind. Why? Why did over 200 cultures around the world preserve remarkably similar stories about catastrophic floods? Some skeptics argue it's because floods are common, that every culture experiences river flooding and tsunamis and storm surges, and so every culture develops flood mythology. But that doesn't explain the consistency. These aren't just stories about floods. They're stories about the flood, a world-ending event that killed almost everyone and everything. They describe waters covering mountains, drowning entire continents, destroying civilization itself. That's not the kind of story you develop from watching a river overflow its banks every spring. That's the kind of story you tell when something genuinely catastrophic happened. Something so traumatic that your ancestors couldn't stop talking about it. Consider what it would take for a story to survive 11,600 years. That's roughly 465 generations if we assume a new generation every 25 years. Each generation has to hear the story, remember it accurately enough, and consider it important enough to pass on to their children. For this to happen across multiple continents, across cultures that developed in complete isolation from each other, the original event must have been absolutely catastrophic. It must have affected people everywhere. And it must have been so terrifying, so world-shaking that the survivors couldn't let it be forgotten. The meltwater pulse, the rapid sea level rise, the flooding of coastal regions where most humans lived. All of this fits perfectly. This wasn't just a flood. This was the flood. A genuine global catastrophe that disrupted human societies across multiple continents simultaneously. Think about what would happen to oral tradition after such an event. Small survivor groups scattered across drowned landscapes, maintaining only fragments of their former culture. The most important stories would be the ones about survival, about how we made it through when everything seemed lost. Parents would tell children, "This is what happened. This is why we live here now. This is why the world changed." And because the event was real, because it actually happened to their ancestors, the core elements would remain consistent even as details varied by culture. The gods might change names. The heroes might be different. The boat might become a raft or a reed or a mountaintop refuge. But the fundamental narrative would persist. World-destroying water. Narrow survival. Traumatic transformation. What we're looking at across all these mythologies isn't evidence of one culture copying another's stories. We're looking at independent cultural memories of the same event, filtered through thousands of years of retelling, adapted to local beliefs and circumstances, but preserving a core truth. 11,600 years ago, the world nearly drowned. The waters rose so fast and so high that it seemed like the gods themselves had decided to destroy humanity. Most people died. Most settlements were lost. Entire coastlines vanished beneath the waves. But some survived. And those survivors told their children what had happened. And those children told their children. And so on for 465 generations until we started writing the stories down and wondering why cultures around the world all remembered the same catastrophe. We are the descendants of the survivors. And the stories are our inheritance. Every flood myth, every legend of rising waters and narrow escape, is an echo of actual human experience. Our ancestors lived through something that should have destroyed them, and they made absolutely certain we would never forget it. Here's where the story stops being just mythology and starts becoming archaeology. Because if a massive flood really did reshape human civilization 11,600 years ago, drowning coastal settlements and forcing survivors to start over, we should find evidence. And guess what? We're finding it. Cities that weren't supposed to exist. Built by people who weren't supposed to have the knowledge or technology to build them. Preserved beneath hundreds of feet of water that rose when the Ice Age ended. Let's start in the Gulf of Khumbat off the western coast of India. In 2001, marine archaeologists conducting routine pollution surveys stumbled across something that shouldn't exist. Sonar readings showing geometric patterns on the seafloor. Not random geology, not natural formations, but structures, walls, foundations, what appeared to be streets laid out in a grid pattern. All of it sitting under 120 feet of water, 5 miles from the modern coastline. They called it Dvarka, though nobody knows if that was its real name. The ancient Indian texts describe a magnificent city by that name built by Lord Krishna, swallowed by the sea. Most historians assumed it was pure mythology. Then divers started bringing up artifacts, stone tools, pottery fragments, pieces of what appeared to be walls constructed from massive stone blocks. Some of these blocks weighed several tons. Carbon dating of organic material found in the sediment surrounding the structures gave dates ranging from 7,500 to 9,500 years old. But here's where it gets really interesting. The structures aren't just old. They're sophisticated. Sonar imaging shows what appear to be stepped platforms organized in geometric patterns that suggest urban planning. This isn't random piles of rocks that happen to look like buildings. This is evidence of architectural knowledge, construction techniques, and most importantly, social organization capable of mobilizing the labor needed to build on this scale. Think about what this means. According to conventional archaeology, humans 9,500 years ago were supposed to be small bands of hunter-gatherers, maybe just beginning to experiment with early agriculture. They weren't supposed to be building cities with grid patterns and massive stone foundations. They weren't supposed to have the engineering knowledge required to construct multi-ton structures. They definitely weren't supposed to have the complex social hierarchies needed to organize and feed the workforce such construction would require. But there it is, sitting on the seafloor, preserved by the same water that drowned it. Evidence that somebody with advanced knowledge and capabilities was living on that coast before it flooded. Now travel 4,000 miles east to the southern coast of Japan near the island of Yonaguni. In 1985, a dive tour operator was looking for good places to observe hammerhead sharks when he found something far more interesting. Massive stone formations on the seafloor carved into steps, terraces, and right angles. Walls that appear to be cut with precision. Channels that look suspiciously like roads or canals. A structure that some researchers have called the Yonaguni Monument. The debate about Yonaguni has been fierce. Skeptics insist it's all natural, just sandstone that fractured along natural plains and happened to look artificial. And they might be right about some of it. Sandstone does sometimes break in straight lines, does occasionally create formations that look geometric. But then there are the details that are hard to explain naturally. Tool marks on some surfaces that look suspiciously like quarrying. Holes drilled in precise patterns that would require intentional effort. Steps that are too uniform, too regular to be random erosion. A formation that some researchers interpret as a carved face, complete with what appear to be eyes and a mouth. Most tellingly, the structure sits at a depth that corresponds exactly to where the coastline would have been during the last ice age, before sea levels rose. If it was built before flooding, that places construction somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. Right in the window of the Younger Dryas impact event and the subsequent massive sea level rise. Right when conventional archaeology says nobody in. Japan should have been capable of monumental architecture. But here's the thing about underwater archaeology. It's really, really hard. You can't just excavate like you would on land. You're fighting currents, limited visibility, depth restrictions, enormous expense. Every dive is a race against time and physics. So the evidence from places like Dvarka and Yonaguni remains frustratingly incomplete. Tantalizing hints of something important, but not enough detail to convince mainstream archaeology that everything needs rethinking. Unless you find something that can't be dismissed. Something so obviously artificial, so clearly sophisticated that it forces a complete reassessment of what ancient humans were capable of. Enter Göbekli Tepe. Now, technically, Göbekli Tepe isn't underwater. It's in southeastern Turkey, sitting on a hilltop that was never flooded. But its relevance to our flood story is impossible to overstate because Göbekli Tepe proves that sophisticated civilization existed before the conventional timeline says it should have. And it was built right around 11,600 years ago, right as the world was recovering from the flood. The site consists of massive stone circles, each containing elaborately carved T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons. These aren't crude stone arrangements. They're precisely shaped megalithic structures decorated with detailed carvings of animals. Lions, bulls, scorpions, birds. The level of artistry is stunning. These people weren't just surviving. They were creating sophisticated religious or ceremonial centers that required thousands of hours of skilled labor. Evidence of sophisticated social organization emerging from the post-flood chaos. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe date to approximately 9,600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago, right at the end of the Younger Dryas. Right when the ice was melting and sea levels were rising and coastal populations would have been fleeing inland, carrying with them whatever knowledge and technologies they developed. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of civilization but a continuation? What if the people who built it were refugees from coastal cities that had been drowned, bringing architectural and astronomical knowledge that seems impossibly advanced for the supposed timeline of human development? Because here's what really challenges conventional thinking. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were supposedly hunter-gatherers. Agriculture hadn't been invented yet, according to standard chronology. These were people who should have been living in temporary camps, following herds, gathering wild plants. Instead, they were quarrying 20-ton stones, transporting them to construction sites, carving them with sophisticated imagery, and erecting them in precisely oriented ceremonial complexes. That requires planning, organization, specialized knowledge, and most importantly, social structures capable of freeing up enough people from food gathering to allow for monumental construction. Where did that knowledge come from? How did supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers suddenly develop engineering and organizational capabilities that wouldn't appear again for thousands of years? The conventional answer is that we've underestimated ancient humans, that they were smarter and more capable than we gave them credit for, and that complex societies emerged independently right around this time. But what if the simpler explanation is that the knowledge wasn't new? What if it was preserved knowledge carried by survivors of earlier coastal civilizations that had been destroyed by the rising waters? The evidence from underwater archaeology suggests this might not be as crazy as it sounds. Because Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. We're finding submerged settlements all over the world in places that were dry land during the Ice Age and are now underwater. The Black Sea, for instance, contains dozens of drowned settlements along what used to be its shores before the catastrophic flood around 5,600 BCE raised water levels by several hundred feet. That's thousands of years after the main Younger Dryas flooding. But it shows the pattern. Coastal populations building settlements at what they thought was a safe distance from the water, then getting overwhelmed when sea levels rose faster than they could adapt. In the Mediterranean, marine archaeologists have discovered submerged structures off the coasts of Greece, Italy, and the Levant. Some of these sites show evidence of organized settlements with stone foundations, storage areas, and what appear to be harbor facilities. They're sitting in water that rose during the post-Ice Age sea level changes. Carbon dating places some of them in the crucial window between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. Off the coast of Cyprus, divers have found what appears to be an entire submerged village, complete with wells that were dug when the site was above water. The village dates to around 9,000 years ago and sits under 40 feet of water. It's preserved remarkably well because the Mediterranean is relatively calm and the structures were quickly buried in sediment after flooding. You can see walls, doorways, courtyards laid out in organized patterns. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was a permanent settlement built by people who expected to stay, who had invested enormous effort in construction, and who were then forced to abandon everything when the waters rose. The same pattern shows up along continental shelves worldwide. During the Ice Age, sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. That exposed vast areas of what is now seafloor. The continental shelves, those shallow underwater extensions of continents, were dry land. And they weren't marginal land either. They were prime real estate, flat, fertile coastal plains with access to both marine and terrestrial resources. Perfect places for human settlement. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, all of that land went underwater. Not slowly enough for people to gradually retreat inland. We're talking about sea level rise of potentially several feet per year during the most catastrophic periods. Anyone living on those coastal plains would have been displaced. Their settlements drowned. their cultural centers lost beneath hundreds of feet of water. Only in the last few decades, with the development of sophisticated sonar, submersibles, and underwater excavation techniques, have we begun to discover what's down there. And what we're finding is shocking. Stone tools scattered across submerged continental shelves, pottery fragments, foundations of structures, even what appear to be ancient hearths, fire pits where people cooked meals 12,000 years ago, now preserved under hundreds of feet of seawater. Each discovery pushes back the timeline of human sophistication a little further. Each find suggests that the conventional story of civilization beginning around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia is incomplete at best, fundamentally wrong at worst. The artifacts themselves tell a story. Many of the tools recovered from these submerged sites show technological sophistication that supposedly didn't exist yet. Composite tools with multiple materials hafted together. Carefully shaped blades requiring advanced knapping techniques. Polished stone that indicates not just functional toolmaking but aesthetic consideration. Pottery that shows firing techniques and decorative arts that suggest settled societies with time for craft specialization. But perhaps the most intriguing discoveries are the ones that suggest advanced knowledge in areas that supposedly primitive societies shouldn't have possessed. Astronomical alignments at sites like Göbekli Tepe that indicate precise observations of celestial movements. Standardized measurement systems implied by the consistent dimensions of structures across multiple sites. Metallurgical knowledge appearing thousands of years before conventional timelines say it should. Take the astronomical knowledge first. Göbekli Tepe's pillars are oriented with precision to specific celestial events. The winter solstice sunrise aligns with certain structures. Specific star patterns that would have been visible 11,600 years ago correspond to animal carvings on the pillars. This isn't casual sky watching. This is systematic observation over multiple generations, sophisticated enough to encode astronomical information in permanent monuments. Why would hunter-gatherers need or want to do this unless they were carrying forward knowledge traditions from earlier, more advanced societies? The standardized measurements are even more puzzling. Analysis of multiple ancient sites separated by hundreds or thousands of miles sometimes shows the use of consistent measurement units. Not metric or imperial, obviously, but prehistoric standards that different cultures seem to have shared. This suggests either direct contact between distant groups or, more intriguingly, inheritance of measurement systems from a common ancestral civilization that predated the regional cultures. A civilization that might have been coastal, might have been advanced, and might have been largely destroyed by the post-Ice Age flooding. The metallurgical mysteries are perhaps most challenging to conventional chronology. Standard archaeology places the beginning of copper working around 7,000 years ago, bronze around 5,000 years ago. But we keep finding earlier examples. Copper artifacts that date to 9,000 years ago. Evidence of smelting techniques at sites that supposedly predate the invention of metalworking. Each discovery gets dismissed as anomalous, gets dated and redated until it fits the existing timeline, or gets quietly shelved when it refuses to fit. But what if these aren't anomalies? What if they're evidence of technological knowledge that existed before the flood, was lost when coastal civilizations were destroyed, and then had to be slowly rediscovered over thousands of years? That would explain why we see apparent sophistication, then a long gap, then sophistication again. Not because humans forgot how to be smart, but because catastrophic flooding destroyed the centers of knowledge and forced survivors to rebuild from fragments. The pattern repeats across too many sites to dismiss easily. Advanced architecture appearing suddenly in the archaeological record as if the knowledge came from somewhere else. Astronomical observations encoded in monuments by people who supposedly had no writing system. Artistic sophistication and craft specialization in societies that supposedly hadn't yet settled down permanently. Shared myths of catastrophic floods and lost golden ages across cultures that had no contact with each other. Each piece of evidence taken alone can be questioned, reinterpreted, dismissed. But taken together, they suggest something remarkable. That human civilization might be older than we think. That the catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age didn't just reshape coastlines. It destroyed centers of human development that had existed for thousands of years. that the survivors of that flooding, displaced from drowned coastal cities, carried whatever knowledge they could preserve inland, where it manifested in places like Göbekli Tepe as seemingly impossible sophistication among supposedly primitive peoples. We're still at the beginning of understanding what's beneath the waves. Most of the continental shelves remain unexplored. Most submerged sites haven't been found yet, let alone excavated. Every year brings new discoveries, new sites that challenge existing timelines, new evidence that humans were more advanced, more widespread, more sophisticated than conventional archaeology has acknowledged. The flood didn't just change geography. It might have reset human civilization, forcing our ancestors to rebuild from the ruins of something we're only now beginning to rediscover. Preserved beneath the waters that drowned it 11,600 years ago. So picture this. The waters are receding. After months, maybe years of unimaginable flooding, the great deluge that reshaped the world is finally pulling back, leaving behind a landscape that nobody recognizes anymore. Coastal plains that had sustained human populations for thousands of years. Gone, buried under hundreds of feet of water. River valleys where your ancestors had built seasonal camps, flooded beyond recognition. The familiar landmarks that had guided human movement for generations, washed away like they never existed. And your people, the survivors, they're scattered, traumatized, desperately trying to understand what just happened and figure out how to survive in a world that has fundamentally changed overnight. Because here's the thing about survivors of catastrophic disasters. They don't just pick up where they left off. They can't. The world they knew is gone. The strategies that worked for their parents and grandparents, many of them are suddenly useless. They have to adapt or die. And adapt they did. But not all at once, not everywhere, and not without massive loss and suffering along the way. The first challenge was obvious. Get away from the water. Communities that had lived near coastlines for generations had to move. Not just a few miles inland, but sometimes hundreds of miles, abandoning everything they couldn't carry. Archaeological evidence from this period shows exactly this pattern. Coastal settlements that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years suddenly go silent around 11,600 years ago. No more tool deposits. No more fire pits. No more evidence of human habitation. And at the same time, we see a dramatic increase in inland settlements. Places that had been lightly populated or completely empty suddenly show dense concentrations of human activity. These weren't organized migrations. There were no governments coordinating refugee movements, no aid agencies setting up camps. Just small groups of desperate people moving inland, following higher ground, looking for territory that wouldn't flood again. And that created its own problems. Because the inland regions weren't empty. They were already occupied by other human groups who had been living there for generations. Groups who suddenly found themselves dealing with waves of refugees fleeing the flooded coastlands. Some groups welcomed the newcomers. Extended kinship networks probably helped. If you could prove connection to the local population through marriage or trade relationships, you might be allowed to settle, integrate, share resources. But other encounters must have been violent. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of conflict. Burned settlements, mass graves, skeletal remains bearing the marks of trauma. When resources are scarce and survival is uncertain, humans don't always choose cooperation. Sometimes they choose violence. But the flooding didn't just create a refugee crisis. It fundamentally changed the environments that humans depended on. And this forced them to rethink everything about how they survived. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors had been hunter-gatherers. Mobile groups that followed seasonal resources, hunting migrating animals, harvesting wild plants, moving constantly to exploit whatever nature provided. This strategy had carried humans through every climate disaster, every environmental challenge for millennia. It was proven, reliable, flexible. But after the flood, mobility became harder. The coastal plains that had provided highways for human movement were underwater. Rivers had changed course, cutting new channels through unfamiliar territory. Traditional migration routes were disrupted. Animal populations were scattered, disoriented by the dramatic environmental changes. The old patterns didn't work anymore. And here's where something revolutionary happened. Faced with disrupted mobility and uncertain resources, some human groups made a choice that would change history forever. They stopped moving, they settled down, and they started deliberately cultivating plants instead of just gathering what grew wild. This wasn't planned. Nobody sat down and invented agriculture. It emerged gradually, desperately, as scattered groups of survivors tried to guarantee food security in an unpredictable world. You can't follow the herds if you don't know where they're going anymore. You can't rely on seasonal plant harvests if the climate patterns have changed. So you start saving seeds from the plants that grew well. You clear ground around your settlement and scatter those seeds, hoping they'll grow again. You notice which plants respond well to human intervention, which ones produce more food when you water them, protect them, encourage them. Within a few generations, some groups had transitioned from opportunistic gardening to systematic agriculture. They were planting fields, not just scattered patches. They were selecting for desirable traits in their crops, saving seeds from the biggest grains, the sweetest fruits, the most productive plants. They were creating the first domesticated crops: wheat, barley, lentils, peas, plants that would become the foundation of civilization. And agriculture changed everything. Once you're farming, you can't be mobile anymore. You have to stay near your fields, protect them from animals and rival groups, harvest at the right time. So settlements became permanent. Villages grew up around agricultural fields. For the first time in human history, people were living in the same place generation after generation. And permanent settlements required entirely new social structures. Hunter-gatherer bands are small, maybe 20 to 50 people, everyone related, relatively equal. But agricultural villages could support hundreds of people. That requires organization, leadership, rules about who owns what land, systems for resolving disputes, methods of storing and distributing surplus food. The archaeological record shows this transformation happening rapidly in multiple regions simultaneously. In the Fertile Crescent, the arc of territory stretching from Egypt through the Levant to Mesopotamia, we see the first permanent villages appearing right after the flood period. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities, shows dramatic expansion around 11,600 years ago. What had been a small seasonal camp suddenly becomes a fortified settlement with stone walls and tower structures. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, sites like Göbekli Tepe show massive construction projects beginning in this same period. These weren't simple villages. These were complex ritual centers requiring hundreds of people working in coordinated labor gangs. Evidence of sophisticated social organization emerging from the post-flood chaos. Similar patterns appear in China along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, in the Indus Valley, even in the Americas. Everywhere the flood had disrupted traditional lifeways, humans responded by settling down and intensifying their relationship with the landscape. But knowledge transfer became critical in this new world. The survival strategies that had worked for your ancestors might not work anymore. You needed new information fast: how to select seeds, when to plant, how to store surplus grain, which soils produce the best crops. This information was too valuable to lose, so your people developed systems to preserve it across generations. This is where oral tradition becomes crucial. We tend to think of oral cultures as primitive, unreliable, inferior to written records. But that's completely wrong. Oral traditions, when properly maintained, can preserve detailed information with remarkable accuracy across thousands of years. And in the post-flood world, they became the primary method of knowledge transmission. Stories about the flood itself were obviously important. They served as warnings, cautionary tales about the power of water and the need to respect its dangers. But oral traditions also preserved practical survival information disguised as stories. How to recognize weather patterns, which plants were edible, where to find water during drought, what warning signs preceded disasters. The flood stories that appear in cultures worldwide aren't just myths. They're encoded knowledge, information, packages designed to survive transmission across dozens of generations. They use memorable narratives, dramatic imagery, emotional resonance to ensure the information sticks in human memory. A story about divine punishment for human wickedness is easier to remember than a list of instructions about settlement location. But embedded in that story is crucial information. Build on high ground. Prepare for disasters. Maintain food reserves. Respect the power of nature. This knowledge kept communities alive when environmental conditions were still unpredictable, when the climate was still adjusting to the dramatic changes of the flood period. And as agricultural villages grew into towns, then cities, these oral traditions evolved into more formal religious and spiritual systems. The trauma of the flood became embedded in humanity's collective psychology. You can see it in the religious texts that emerged thousands of years later. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the biblical flood narrative, the Hindu story of Manu and the Great Flood. These aren't separate inventions. They're cultural memories, distorted by time, but preserving the essential experience of that catastrophic event 11,600 years ago. The psychological impact was profound. Your ancestors had learned that the world could change catastrophically without warning, that safety was an illusion, that everything familiar could be destroyed in days or weeks. This created what anthropologists call cultural trauma, a collective wound that shapes how societies understand themselves and their place in the universe. It drove the development of religious systems focused on appeasing divine forces, ensuring disasters wouldn't happen again. It motivated the construction of massive monuments and temples, attempts to create permanence in a world that had proven itself frighteningly impermanent. But the survivors also developed practical responses to the flood trauma. Within centuries, communities were building systematic flood management systems. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, early agricultural societies developed complex irrigation networks, canals, dikes, levees to control water flow and protect settlements. In Egypt, communities learned to predict and exploit the annual flooding of the Nile, developing agricultural systems that depended on regular inundation to fertilize fields. In China, early flood control systems along the Yellow River became foundational to Chinese civilization. These weren't simple projects. They required massive coordinated labor, sophisticated engineering knowledge, and centralized authority to organize and maintain. And their construction drove the development of increasingly complex social hierarchies. You need leaders to organize labor gangs. You need specialists who understand hydraulic engineering. You need administrators to manage resources and distribution. You need enforcement mechanisms to ensure everyone contributes their share. The cities and states that emerged from agricultural villages weren't just larger. They were fundamentally different types of social organization with specialized roles, class stratification, formal political structures. And here's what's remarkable. This entire transformation, from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural societies to complex civilizations with cities and states, happened incredibly fast. Within 5,000 years of the flood, humans had gone from scattered bands to building pyramids, developing writing systems, creating empires. That's nothing in evolutionary terms. It's barely a blink. The flood hadn't just disrupted human societies. It had created exactly the conditions under which rapid cultural evolution could occur. Disrupted traditional patterns forced innovation. Concentrated populations in smaller territories encouraged competition and cooperation simultaneously. Resource uncertainty motivated development of storage systems and surplus accumulation. The trauma of near-total destruction created powerful motivation to build lasting monuments and preserve knowledge for future generations. Every challenge the flood created pushed human societies toward greater complexity, more sophisticated technology, more elaborate social organization. But not everyone made this transition at the same time or in the same way. While some groups were building cities in Mesopotamia and Egypt, others remained hunter-gatherers, maintaining traditional lifeways in regions less affected by the flooding or where mobile strategies still worked well. This created enormous diversity in human cultural development. Agricultural societies and hunter-gatherer societies existing simultaneously, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, sometimes ignoring each other completely. The descendants of flood survivors who settled in river valleys developed writing to track agricultural surplus and trade goods. Those who remained mobile developed incredibly detailed oral maps of their territories, knowledge systems that could navigate thousands of miles without written records. Neither was superior. Both were adaptations to different environments and different challenges. But the agricultural societies, because they could support larger populations and accumulate more resources, gradually expanded, absorbing or displacing mobile groups. Within a few thousand years, agriculture had spread to every continent except Antarctica, carrying with it the complex social structures that agriculture enabled. And throughout this transformation, the memory of the flood persisted. Not as scientific knowledge about sea level rise and glacial melt, but as cultural memory embedded in stories, rituals, and beliefs. Every agricultural society that emerged in the post-flood world carried some version of the flood story. Sometimes it was central to their religious system, like in Mesopotamia. Sometimes it was peripheral, a minor tale in a broader mythology. But it was always there. A reminder that the world had once been destroyed, and that the ancestors had survived through a combination of luck, skill, and divine favor. This memory shaped how these new civilizations understood their relationship with the natural world. They weren't separate from nature or superior to it. They were survivors, dependent on forces beyond their control, living in a world that had proven itself capable of apocalyptic change. And that understanding, that knowledge that catastrophe was always possible, drove them to create systems designed to last. To build in stone rather than wood. To preserve knowledge in writing rather than memory alone. To construct societies that could survive the death of individual rulers or the collapse of individual cities. We are the descendants of those survivors. Every complex society that exists today traces its roots back to those post-flood millennia when humans fundamentally reimagined how to live. The cities we build, the food we eat, the governments we create, even the religions we practice, all emerged from the adaptations our ancestors made to survive in a world that had been catastrophically transformed. The flood changed everything, but it didn't destroy us. Instead, it forced us to become something new, something more adaptable, more innovative, more capable of reshaping our environment to meet our needs. The flood that nearly ended humanity became the event that made us who we are. So, here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because everything we've been talking about, this catastrophic flood 11,600 years ago that transformed human civilization, it's not just ancient history. It's a preview, a warning written in sediment and stone about what happens when ice melts and seas rise and humanity has to adapt or die. Let's talk about what's happening right now. Sea levels are rising. Not as fast as they did during the Younger Dryas collapse. Not yet, but they're rising about 3.4 millimeters per year globally, which doesn't sound like much until you do the math. That's 34 centimeters per century. At current rates, that's enough to displace hundreds of millions of people from coastal cities by the year 2100. And here's the thing. Current rates might be the optimistic scenario, because 11,600 years ago taught us something crucial about how ice sheets die. They don't melt gradually and predictably. They collapse. Think of it like a dam made of ice. It holds and holds and holds, then suddenly cracks, and everything behind it comes rushing out at once. The Younger Dryas event probably involved exactly this kind of catastrophic ice sheet collapse. Massive sections of the North American ice sheet breaking off and sliding into the ocean within days or weeks, displacing so much water that sea levels jumped meters in a single human lifetime. We have ice sheets today. Greenland and Antarctica contain enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by about 65 meters if they melted completely. Nobody's saying they'll all melt tomorrow, but we don't need complete melting to cause catastrophe. The Younger Dryas flood that reshaped human history probably involved sea level rise of maybe 3 to 5 meters total. That was enough to drown coastlines, submerge cities, force massive population movements, and fundamentally alter the course of human development. 5 meters. That's less than 10% of what we currently have locked up in ice. The geological evidence is what should really keep us awake at night, because it tells us that rapid sea level rise isn't some unprecedented freak event. This happened before, multiple times during the Ice Age cycles. We've found evidence of catastrophic flooding in sediment cores from coastlines all over the world. Ancient beaches that are now underwater. River deltas that got drowned when oceans surged inland. Archaeological sites that suddenly disappear from the record because they ended up 50 meters below the waves. And every time it happened, human populations had to move or die. There was no third option. Look at modern coastal cities and think about what would happen if seas rose just 3 meters in the next 50 years. Not over centuries, but within a single human lifetime, like what happened 11,600 years ago. Miami disappears. Most of Bangladesh goes underwater, displacing 150 million people. Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, Jakarta, all cities with populations in the tens of millions, all partially or completely submerged. The economic damage would be measured not in billions but in tens of trillions of dollars. The humanitarian crisis would dwarf anything in recorded history. And unlike our ancestors 11,600 years ago, we can't just migrate to higher ground. Because there are 8 billion of us now. And all the high ground is already occupied. Our ancestors had empty continents to colonize. We have borders, nations, political systems that aren't designed to handle hundreds of millions of climate refugees all moving at once. But here's what studying the ancient flood teaches us. Humanity survives. Not easily, not without tremendous suffering and loss, but we survive. Because we're adaptable. The people who lived through the Younger Dryas catastrophe didn't have our technology or our scientific understanding. They couldn't predict when the next flood would come or how high the waters would rise. They didn't have early warning systems or engineered flood barriers or international aid organizations. What they had was resilience, the ability to recognize when the world was changing and adapt their survival strategies accordingly. When the floods came, they moved. When familiar resources disappeared, they learned to exploit new ones. When traditional territories became uninhabitable, they found new places to live, or they died trying. And the ones who survived, the ones who adapted fastest and most effectively, they became the ancestors of every human civilization that came after, including ours. This is why studying sites like Göbekli Tepe and the submerged settlements off India's coast matters so much. They're not just interesting archaeological curiosities. They're case studies in survival. Every drowned city we find teaches us something about how human societies respond to catastrophic environmental change. What strategies worked? What strategies failed? How fast can populations relocate? How is cultural knowledge preserved or lost during crisis periods? The ongoing search for submerged archaeological sites is revealing just how much we lost under the waves. Marine archaeologists using sonar mapping have identified what look like human structures 40, 50, even 60 meters below current sea level in multiple locations around the world. Off the coast of India, Japan, Cuba, the Mediterranean. Structures that would have been high and dry when sea levels were lower but got drowned when the ice melted. Most of these sites remain unexplored. They're too deep for easy diving, too scattered to survey systematically with our current technology and limited funding. But every site we do manage to investigate reveals the same pattern. Sophisticated settlements built by people who understood agriculture, architecture, probably astronomy and mathematics. Then suddenly abandoned as rising waters made them uninhabitable. We're looking at a lost world down there. Entire civilizations that developed during the Ice Age, flourished for thousands of years, then disappeared under the waves when the climate changed. The flood myths remember them, but the physical evidence has been hidden under 50 meters of ocean for 11,600 years. And here's what should really concern us. We don't know how fast it happened. The geological evidence gives us rough timescales, centuries or millennia for the overall sea level rise. But the flood myths suggest something faster. Catastrophic events that transformed the world within a single human lifetime. Massive floods that came suddenly enough to become burned into cultural memory so deeply that people were still telling the stories thousands of years later. If sea level rise was gradual, people would have adapted slowly, moved inland gradually over generations as the waters crept higher. There wouldn't be dramatic flood myths, just a general cultural memory of coastlines that used to be further out. But instead, we have stories of world-destroying floods from dozens of cultures that had no contact with each other. Stories that describe waters rising so fast that people barely escaped. Cities drowning in days or weeks. Populations fleeing inland with whatever they could carry. That pattern suggests catastrophic events, not gradual change. Ice dams breaking, massive floods surging down river valleys, storm surges amplified by higher sea levels that push saltwater miles inland. Events that happened fast enough and were traumatic enough that people remembered them and told their children. Who told their children? Who told their children until the stories became mythology? We could face the same thing. Current climate models generally predict gradual sea level rise over centuries. But those models might not account for catastrophic ice sheet collapse. We've seen glaciers in Greenland lose decades worth of ice in single summer melting seasons. We've seen ice shelves in Antarctica that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly disintegrate within months. The geological record tells us that ice sheets can go from stable to catastrophically collapsing faster than our models predict. And if that happens, if Greenland or West Antarctica has a runaway collapse event within the next 50 years, we won't have centuries to adapt. We'll have decades, maybe less. The question isn't whether we can survive it. The evidence from 11,600 years ago proves humans can survive catastrophic environmental change. We've done it before. We could do it again. The question is how much we lose in the process, and whether we're smart enough to start preparing now instead of waiting until the waters are already rising. Because here's the thing our ancestors didn't have that we do: foresight. They couldn't predict the flood. They couldn't see it coming decades in advance and make preparations. They couldn't build infrastructure or relocate populations or develop technologies specifically designed to handle rising seas. They had to react in the moment, dealing with catastrophe as it happened. We don't have that excuse. We can see what's coming. Maybe not the exact timing, maybe not the precise magnitude, but we know sea levels are rising. We know ice sheets are becoming unstable. We know coastal cities are vulnerable. We know from geological evidence that rapid catastrophic change is possible. Not just theoretical. The ancient flood survivors didn't get to choose whether they wanted to adapt. They adapted or they died. Their cities got drowned. Their territories got submerged. Their whole world changed. And they had to change with it or go extinct. We still have time to make choices. Time to study what happened 11,600 years ago and learn from it. Time to search for those drowned cities and understand how our ancestors survived similar catastrophes. Time to build resilience into our coastal infrastructure, develop migration strategies, preserve knowledge systems that might need to survive through a period of massive disruption. But only if we pay attention. Only if we recognize that the flood myths aren't just stories. They're warnings. Messages from our ancestors who survived the last great catastrophe, telling us it can happen again. Will happen again eventually. Whether in our lifetimes or our grandchildren's lifetimes or 1,000 years from now, ice will melt, seas will rise, and humanity will have to prove once again that we're the descendants of survivors. The question isn't whether we can adapt. It's whether we'll be smart enough to start adapting before the waters force us to. Our ancestors 11,600 years ago didn't have a choice. We still do. For now. So here we are. We've traveled together from the end of the last ice age through the catastrophic melt that released unimaginable volumes of water across flooded landscapes where entire civilizations drowned in a matter of weeks, and into the aftermath where survivors had to rebuild everything from scratch. But here's the thing about that flood 11,600 years ago. It wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a reset button for human civilization. Think about what the world looked like before. You had scattered populations living in coastal settlements, river valleys, and low-lying plains that had been stable for thousands of years. These weren't primitive people. They had developed sophisticated technologies, built permanent structures, established trade networks that spanned continents. They had art, ritual, complex social organizations. They were well on their way to creating what we'd recognize as civilization. Then the water came, and in a geological instant, which is still pretty fast even in human terms, entire landscapes were erased. Settlements that had existed for generations, gone. Hunting grounds that had sustained populations for millennia, submerged. Trade routes that had connected distant communities, obliterated. The survivors, and remember, there were survivors, they didn't just lose their homes. They lost their entire world. The coastal plains where their ancestors had lived for hundreds of generations were now underwater. The river valleys that had been centers of population were flooded beyond recognition. The familiar landmarks that had guided travelers for thousands of years simply didn't exist anymore. So they moved. They had to. They relocated to higher ground, to territories that had previously been marginal and less desirable. And here's where it gets really interesting. When you force people to abandon everything they know and start over, you strip away all the accumulated traditions and established ways of doing things. You create conditions where innovation isn't just advantageous. It's absolutely necessary. The archaeological record shows exactly this happening in the centuries after the flood. We see an explosion of new technologies. Systematic agriculture, not just opportunistic plant gathering, but intentional cultivation of specific crops. Advanced pottery for food storage, monumental architecture, temples and communal structures that required coordinated labor from hundreds of people. These weren't gradual developments that had been slowly evolving. They appeared relatively suddenly in the post-flood period as if someone had flipped a switch. But it wasn't a switch. It was necessity. When you destroy people's old ways of surviving, they either innovate or die. The flood survivors innovated. They took the knowledge and skills their ancestors had developed over thousands of years and recombined them in new ways, adapted them to new environments, refined them under pressure. Within a few thousand years of the flood, we see the first cities appearing. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Jericho in the Jordan Valley, Çatalhöyük in Anatolia. These weren't just villages. They were complex urban centers with specialized labor, social hierarchies, and organized religion. This is what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer societies to settled agricultural civilizations. And it happened remarkably quickly after the Great Flood. Coincidence? Maybe, but probably not. The flood also did something else. Something that echoes through human culture to this day. It created a shared trauma memory that transcended individual cultures and societies. We've talked about how nearly every ancient civilization has flood myths. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the biblical story of Noah, the Greek legend of Deucalion, Hindu accounts of Manu, Chinese stories of Gun and Yu, Aztec legends of the destruction of the fourth sun. These aren't just similar stories. They contain remarkably specific details that match what we know about the real flood event. Waters rising to cover mountains. Survivors taking refuge in boats or high places. A world that was fundamentally transformed when the waters receded. The persistence of these stories across thousands of years and thousands of miles tells us something profound. Some events are so catastrophic, so transformative that they become permanently embedded in human collective memory. They shape how we see the world, how we understand our relationship with nature, how we think about survival and rebirth. We are all descendants of flood survivors. Not metaphorically, literally. Every person alive today carries genes that made it through that catastrophic event 11,600 years ago. Your ancestors were the ones who made it to high ground, who rebuilt when their world was destroyed, who adapted, innovated, and persevered when extinction seemed certain. That's your inheritance. That's what you carry forward. The ability to survive catastrophe, the capacity to adapt when everything changes, the determination to rebuild when the world falls apart. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by change, by crisis, by the sense that everything familiar is being swept away, remember this. Your ancestors survived the literal end of their world. They watched the oceans rise, the coastlines vanish, and entire civilizations drown. And they didn't just survive. They built something new, something that eventually became the foundation for everything that came after. We are the flood survivors. We are the ones who carry their stories, their genes, their unbreakable determination to persist no matter what nature throws at us. That's not just history. That's who we are. If this journey through deep time has resonated with you, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Are you near ancient coastlines that once stood far from the sea? In river valleys that were carved by catastrophic floods? I'd love to hear from you. And if you want more stories about the deep history that shaped us, hit that subscribe button. More ancient mysteries are waiting. Sleep well knowing you descend from survivors. Good night.